Bible study. It's us, your favorite boys. We're back again. As always, I'm Ash. I'm here with my co-hosts,
Scott
and Julian.
Our film today is Wakefield Poole's Bible, 1973 softcore porn with biblical themes. To help give us context for this unique film is our special guest today, Joe Rubin, the co-founder of Vinegar Syndrome, an acclaimed film restoration and distribution company specializing in genre film. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Before we get into talking about our movie that we're reviewing with you, I was hoping you could please give an intro to Vinegar Syndrome for any Boys Bible Study listeners who are not familiar with your work.
Sure. So we Vinegar Syndrome was essentially founded by myself and my first business partner, Ryan. Basically, Vinegar Syndrome was conceived with the notion of we want to put out the types of films that other companies, even companies that are going to be handling genre films, exploitation films, B-movies, cult movies, grindhouse movies, whatever you want to call them, might overlook or might not have the same kind of elaborate treatment to that we felt that they deserved or that they should be getting. So the mantra with Vinegar Syndrome has always been to present all types of genre film on an equal playing field. Like we're not going to elevate one type of movie as being more worthy of preservation than any other type. And that's one of the reasons that, from the start, we always found it very important to restore and release sex films, because that's always been the type of movie that has been overlooked no matter what. So it's kind of interesting to see how the company has become known in many ways for releasing sex films, even though it actually only represents like a quarter to a third of our overall output. But I think if anything, that speaks to the importance that what we've done has made on how people have perceived these types of movies.
It really does. And the quality of what you guys put out is, I would say, at least as good as Criterion at this point. I think a lot of cinephiles think of that as like the gold standard, but what y'all do really is like on that level. And it's so cool to be able to get like something like a lost masterpiece from time, or just like a double feature of David Ducato movies, and it's an immaculate quality either way. So really appreciate that. So Joe, if you could also talk about how, like, was there any specific media from your youth that turned you on to this sort of thing? Or was there anything what made you aware of the importance of film restoration? Like what was the bug that bit you?
I think it came kind of from two different parts of my cinematic upbringing. So from when I basically started watching movies, I always gravitated towards exploitation films, primarily horror movies, as I think a lot of people do. And as I got older, especially, in my teenage years, when concept of special editions of cult movies became kind of a thing with like the emergence of the earlier genre film companies like Synapse and Severin and Blue Underground, it kind of struck a chord with me that like this is the sort of thing that I would love to be involved with. And that coupled with my already main interest in collecting film materials, like I was collecting film prints and then later negatives since I was about 6 years old. And not from a preservation perspective, but just because I liked the idea of film as a tactile medium and as the ideal way of watching a movie shot on film. I sort of fell into the whole world of restoration because I started to talk to more and more distributors and realized that there were a lot of movies that I found interesting or that I was a fan of or had programmed at the movie theater that I was helping to manage that just weren't ever going to see the light of day in terms of restorations. So I started finding ways to actually do restorations on my own. That's how I met Ryan, who I would eventually start Vinegar Syndrome with. He was working at a lab in Chicago, where I'm originally from, and we were connected through a series of random circumstances. And afterwards, he got back in touch with me and said, like, do you want to work on this sort of thing with me? Because I have the access to the equipment, so let's take advantage. and it kind of blossomed from there.
That's great. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Joe, do you have any kind of religious upbringing too, by any chance? Or like, did you go to church when you were a kid? Or, we're going to be talking about Bible today and some other religious movies with religious smut. And is there anything to that from your upbringing?
Not really. I have no like religious hangups. My dad's side is entirely Jewish. My mom's side is entirely Catholic, but I was thankfully raised without either. But I will say that my earliest memory of going to church is when my great uncle died. And I was and this is Catholic church. I was really enthralled with all of the gear, like the priest walking around with the incense and all of like the dress up stuff and like paraphernalia. I think that kind of fit into, because at that point I was really starting to get into like Italian horror, and a lot of Italian movies in general are, of course, referential in some vague way to the church. And as such, I remember like after, even a few years later, like when I was watching exploitation movies or movies, mostly Italian stuff that involved Catholicism, I loved the fetishism of the gear. I don't know if that's the right term for it, but like all the props, the stuff that the priests use, and like the way that the churches are designed to facilitate interaction with objects.
Yeah, and all the ritual of it. It's quite a production.
Yeah, Catholicism especially, of the like common religious practices in the United States, is like absolutely one where like you could call them fetish objects or whatever in a general sense. It's like a huge part of the pageantry of everything. I too find that very compelling, although I was raised Protestant, but I can understand why that struck you. Today, as Scott and Joe were saying, we're going to be talking about actually some smut films with Christian and biblical themes. And, to people who follow our show, that could sound surprising that such a genre exists, but there's actually quite a tradition of it. I thought the main film we're focusing on today, Wakefield Poole's Bible, was quite beautiful in the way that the film deployed that. But before we get into that, I want to talk about in general this genre of religious smut. What are some other recommendations, Joe? Like, what are some movies in this general aesthetic that stand out to you that people might be interested in?
I think it depends on how far you want to take the concept of religious smut or sex films. Like, if you want to just restrict it to movies that are specifically set around biblical stories or within a religious environment, it's somewhat of a smaller list. I would absolutely encourage anyone who's interested in this sort of thing to check out Sodom and Gomorrah, which I completely forgot about until a few minutes ago, which is one of the more elaborate films directed by the Mitchell brothers, who were best known for making Behind the Green Door. And Sodom and Gomorrah is a pretty extravagant production. It had a $500,000 budget, although they apparently snorted around a third of it. I heard from another filmmaker who I know who worked in San Francisco at the same time that they were so heavily promoting the film that there were ads for it on the sides of buses, which again is something that most people living today would be hard pressed to imagine that like a new sex film is being promoted as on bus ads.
Right.
But, Sodom and Gomorrah was essentially their cynical take on the puritanical nature of the American public, where they were kind of satirizing how Americans are or were viewing sex films as like as something that should be punishable. But then they added in elements like a monkey that talks like John Wayne. So it's a strange movie for non-sex film exploitation aficionados. Priscilla Alden, who was the lead actress in criminally insane, has a small role in Sodom and Gomorrah. It's one of the few films that she appeared in otherwise. So you were talking about like the long historical tradition of religious smut, and if you want to go even outside of movies, if you look at the type of erotic photographs that were being taken 100 plus years ago, so in the teens, 20s, the 10s, late 1890s, even possibly, religious iconography was not uncommon. I mean, there are early photo sets as well as stag films that involve nuns and priests and other sorts of clearly religiously inspired elements. There's a very famous stag film from the 1950s called The Nun, or The Nun Story, which involves a woman who's dressed in a nun's habit, and then eventually the nun's habit comes off and just an ordinary sex scene ensues. But even the use of a nun's habit as a complete non-starter element in an otherwise completely generic stag film, I think speaks to how intertwined religious imagery and sex films or sex-related materials always have been.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, a nun's habit, this idea of sort of like it hiding and constricting the body in some way in a spiritual sense. I mean, even Jesus's crucifixion, which has these sort of like kink or bondage significations. If you just look at like the act of it, it's no wonder actually. It might seem counterintuitive on first glance to someone who follows Christian films, but when you really dig in, it's no wonder that this iconography was employed. Wakefield Poole's Bible is a 1973 film. The one you were just talking about, Sodom and Gomorrah, is 1975. On like a meta level, like what is going on in the early to mid 70s with sex films? Like, for people who don't know that history, it seems like they were getting really elaborate and high concept, and like you said, even having ads on like the sides of buses and stuff like that. Very alien to the way pornography is distributed today.
Sure. There was a lot of cultural intersection and artistic intersection going on across the world in regards to how sex was being depicted on the screen, specifically restricting it to the United States. In 1969, very late 1969, more so early 1970, hardcore sex as an unsimulated sex became not legal, but not often prosecuted when it was photographed and shown in movie theaters. And this ushered in a huge amount of films and also filmmakers who wanted to either take advantage monetarily or creatively, or often both, on this new thing that they could never have done before. They could never have done with a certain amount of legal impunity before. So what happened in the very early part of the 70s, like 71 to about 74, there was a huge intersection between the underground art and film scenes and the commercial sex film market. So a lot, not all, but a decent number of the more prolific and especially the more interesting early directors who were making hardcore features came out of, or were at the very least heavily influenced by, underground films, experimental films, pop art films. I mean, you get movies like the Amera Brothers' Bacchanal, which is basically a sex film homage to Maya Daren's Meshes of the Afternoon. So there's a lot of really interesting, creatively interesting stuff being made at this time. And part of that also came from the fact that finally this sort of material was given a level of respectability, not respectability in terms of, free of being shunned or criticized by moralizing organizations, but it became something that people who were in respectable circles, respectable cultural circles, weren't afraid to go to see and weren't afraid to talk about or acknowledge existed. And that also meant that box office receipts were really, really big. So filmmakers who had access to larger budgets could take advantage of making movies that, adjusted for inflation would cost mid to high six figures in today's world, which again, in the porn world, the sex film world today is completely unheard of. I mean, if you have something that costs more than $20,000-$30,000, that's a big budget production. Whereas early to mid 70s and actually through the mid 80s, there were probably over 100 movies that, if adjusted for inflation, would have had budgets over $1 million.
That's amazing to think about. I love that.
But in terms of the religious stuff, there were the majority of the American movies that involved religious themes were made in the first half of the 70s. That was kind of out of the way by the late 70s and certainly in the 80s. And I think that more than anything probably just had to do with like breaking a taboo or being confrontational for the sake of being confrontational. One of the films that we discussed over email, An Act of Confession, which was directed by Sam Weston, whose real name was Sam Weinstein and by implication was raised Jewish, is this kind of seemingly sincere, but also, if you want to look at it on a more cynical level, sarcastic take on religious devotion, where it's basically this nun having a series of sexual experiences in a convent, and then her high point is she gives Jesus a blowjob while he walks on water. It's played very straight, but there is something notably absurd and probably knowingly absurd about the whole setup. So I think that as much as some filmmakers that might have engaged in religious iconography in their work were doing so with certain reverence or desire to say something about religion, others were certainly making very cynical or pointed attacks on religion.
You didn't think the message was just nuns can get horny too?
Maybe. I mean, I can't speculate that much. I think that if you look at Italian nunsploitation movies, which were huge, especially in the late 70s, I think a lot of that is a channeling of Italian sexual repression and fetishization of the church as like this mythic thing that their culture is so heavily based around, but also playing into the notion of like these people who are pure and free from sin are actually dirty, filthy sinners.
That sort of brings us to the feature that's going to be the central point of the rest of our conversation, which is Wakefield Poole's Bible. Again, this is a 1973 film. Wakefield Poole is a pretty interesting American filmmaker, and the circumstances that led up to his Bible film seem to be one of like a critical and like popular like rise and fall. From what I understand, his cinematic debut is quite popular even in the box office. This one was a risk that that didn't pay off, at least as far as money goes. But looking back at it, it's a very interesting film. But who's Wakefield Poole? What's important to know about his backgrounds before we get into this film?
Sure. So Wakefield Poole was a very respected classical dancer who came from Florida, moved to New York, was well-known, well-respected in the New York theater scene, and basically on what amounted to like a bet that he could do something better. He directed a not that great, by his own admission, and I think anyone else's, movie called Boys in the Sand, which in part through how it was marketed and in part because it was certainly different, became the first all-male, as in gay, hardcore movie to really make an impression on a national level. And there were certainly many all-male hardcore and softcore movies made prior to Boys in the Sand, but Boys in the Sand was the first one to really get a lot of attention, not just press, but like, again, mainstream attention. And, Deep Throat is often cited as the movie that spurred the porno chic era. And it was really a building momentum, but I think that some would probably agree, some would disagree, that Boys in the Sand was equally impactful and also came out about 4 months prior, or 6 months prior, actually. So Boys in the Sand became, a huge hit. It was making probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it's kind of an ordinary film if you look at it in context, as well as compared to even some of the films that were made prior in the all-male area. But it struck a chord. And Poole followed it up with a far superior film called Bijou, which is a sort of a dream logic, almost trip film about a guy who goes into this mysterious club that he knows nothing about. And the club is basically this continuous orgy where he wanders from one room to the next and has like increasingly strange sexual encounters with a variety of people. And this was also a huge success. So Poole was kind of riding that, and he didn't want to be pigeonholed, I guess, in the all-male world. So he decided that he would try to branch out and make a film that he hoped would launch him into a more, I don't want to say mainstream, but wider cult movie and underground or midnight movie arena, which is also why Bible was shot softcore. He conceived the film less as like a sex film follow-up to his two previous movies, as much as it was basically intended to be, or was going to be marketed as a midnight movie.
Interesting. That makes sense.
Yeah, and it's it's interesting that he then decided to make this supposed break into more of a midnight movie zone by doing biblical imagery and talking about like a level of sincerity versus like cynicism, or trying to shock or trying to be something about religion. What would we say, guys? I feel like this film was like pretty genuine. Like, it, to me, my personal opinion watching it was that it had respect for the source material, and that it wasn't trying to be edgy. It was a little bit, but it didn't seem like full out cynicism to me,
No, not to me either. And I think that Wakefield Poole said on the DVD for it in the intro that he wanted the viewers to imagine that Adam and Eve really are seeing another human for the first time ever, and like touching another human for the first time ever. And talking about it in that way makes it seem like, very sincere to me.
Yeah, I would say the Bathsheba, Uriah, David storyline was played a little bit for laughs.
Oh yeah, that was definitely played for laughs.
Yeah,
but that seemed also intentional for. Well, the movie's interesting in general because it's giving women in the Bible a better take on their side of the story, and I think that the comedy element helps you humanize Bathsheba a lot more. And like,
yeah, I
feel like it's easy for a lot of people because of like the repressed puritanical society that we live in. If a woman starts off by being sexy, then many people will have like a certain interpretation of who she is, or what that can lead to, and that's maybe her own fault. And I think like it was pretty smart to open with this comedy, because then they're automatically like a relatable human being. They can, an idiot dude can like look past the fact that she's like a pretty woman with clothes half falling off her.
Gotta love the gay male gaze, even when portraying heterosexual softcore. Gay male gaze was a really nice touch in this film. just a little theater of the mind for people who may not get a chance to see this film. Actually, really quick, Joe, how can people see this film? Is this one? Are you all distributing this one, or how is this available?
We have it available on DVD, not Blu-ray, but DVD.
Amazing. So yeah, I would highly recommend checking out this film via Vinegar Syndrome. But for people who might not get to see it or haven't yet, some context for the discussion. Let's briefly take people through the happenings of this movie. I mean, it's pretty surreal. It's not like we can go beat by beat through it, but it focuses on 3 Bible stories, and let's tell people about the plot context for this film.
Well, the first one starts in the beginning, and we see Adam, and he is coming out of the water in this kind of surreal cave. Actually, Joe, do you happen to know where he shot that opening scene, where Wakefield Poole shot that?
Apparently, the openings or the Adam and Eve sequence was shot in the Virgin Islands.
It was very pretty, and it's Adam falls asleep at some point. He's completely naked the whole time. Obviously, which that's another kind of crazy thing. How many Bible stories have been put to film and depicted, and you never actually see people fully naked. It's only suggested, or they've already made like makeshift like leave clothing.
Yeah, no, in a way, this felt like, for the films that we watch that try to portray quote unquote authentic depictions of Bible times, even though this one was surreal and the costuming was not intended to be like period, there was something that's very authentic feeling about the fact that we actually saw Adam and Eve naked, that was pretty interesting. The Adam and Eve sequence is this like very, sexy, softcore sort of ballet, nearly silent. If you know the Bible story, you'll see Adam falling asleep. This is taking place in a beach, but we're definitely supposed to assume it's the Garden of Eden. Just like in the Bible, Adam falls asleep. And although we don't see God or see this process happening, we know that while he was sleeping, God created Eve from Adam's rib. So after Adam falls asleep, we do see a naked woman, an Eve character, come and sort of, massage and pleasure Adam while he's sleeping. This scene is abruptly ended when Eve declares,
"I'm so hungry."
And it just quick cuts to the next Bible story. We see different characters biting into an apple, obviously hinting at the apple in the tree of life, although in a very surreal way. And secondly, in the film, we have a very interesting take on the story of David and Bathsheba and her husband Uriah the Hittite. What can we say about that? How did Wakefield Poole depict this Bible story?
Yeah, so this is done in a way that I kept telling Ash it reminded me of like a Jodorowsky movie, the way the set was like pretty minimal and impressionistic, but you do get the idea that it's this soldier and his wife sitting across the table from each other, sort of having a silly food fight at the dinner table as Bathsheba tries to gain Uriah's attention, but he is preoccupied by his mistress or exotic dancer.
Yeah, who just sort of keeps coming in. Yeah,
who keeps coming in every time Uriah calls her by banging on a gong. Eventually Bathsheba gives up on trying to gain Uriah's attention and goes outside for a bath, where she's witnessed by a very pervily portrayed King David. Doesn't really look like a king either.
No,
just kind of.
It didn't give me really royal vibes, I think,
which I kind of loved.
So yeah, he witnesses her bathing. Uriah is called off to war, and he's not seen from again. I guess we only see the part where David shows up to, get it on with Uriah or with Bathsheba, and then we witness a prolonged Benny Hill style chase between Bathsheba and David until the two finally consummate their whirlwind romance. And that's the conclusion of the story. Left out is, of course, the political romance drama of David having Uriah killed. But that's not important for this movie. We're here for the fucking.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It was fun to see it from Bathsheba's perspective too, though.
Yeah,
I thought she was really funny. I thought she was gave the best performance in the movie.
Joe, anything to say about the cast of this film? Are you familiar with anyone's work outside of this film?
Yeah, absolutely. So Bathsheba is played by Georgina Spelvin, who was a very prolific and popular sex film actress who's best known for playing Miss Jones in The Devil and Miss Jones, but had a nearly 20-year career subsequent, or probably 15-year career subsequent, and is definitely, as a whole, one of the better and more talented actresses who appeared in sex films. She was kind of notable, I suppose, for being much older than most of her contemporaries when she began. She was in her late 30s, and continued working until she was into her mid 50s in starring roles and supporting roles.
Oh, wow.
The actor who plays Adam is, for me, probably the most interesting person in the movie, Beau White. He was also a New York theater actor and had a brief period of turning up in sex films right around this period. And probably the most interesting movie that he was in from a historical perspective, aside from Bible, is a movie called A Very Natural Thing, which is about a priest who decides to leave the monastery to explore his homosexuality and starts an affair with a recently divorced man played by Beau White. So another vaguely religious themed, not really a sex film, but sexually themed movie that Beau White was in right around the same time. And A Very Natural Thing was one of the first non-X-rated movies that involved homosexuality and homosexual sex that kind of made an impression on the art film scene in the U.S. So, Beau White was an interesting character, and this is one of the few movies that he appeared in. I don't really know much about the rest of the people in the film. They were mostly, based on Wakefield Poole's recollections, theater people and a lot of dance people. I know that Gloria Grant, who plays Delilah, who we'll talk about, I guess, in the next sequence, I don't think she was actually in film or theater. She might have just been a model. And this is, again, mostly a cast of people who came either from theater or from the dance world, which, speaks to why so much of the movement feels choreographed, like very heavily choreographed, which of course is also a result of Wakefield Poole's background as a dancer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, let's describe the Samson and Delilah sequence, which is the final leg of the film. And after we do that, I'm sure we'll have some thoughts in general on the look and feel of the film. But what transpires in Wakefield Poole's depiction of the Samson and Delilah story?
Well, it's an interesting take on Samson. And I think still basically biblical, because when you learn about Samson in Sunday school, you just kind of automatically think of him as like a good guy and kind of like a biblical superhero. But there's not really that much text to support that. Like, he could have just as easily been a jerk.
Yeah, I believe
so I thought it was.
I was going to say in some translations I've read, Samson is portrayed as extremely arrogant and just sort of like a show off and a prick.
Oh.
Yeah. And I think he's in the book of Judges. But there are, I don't know which versions, but I know there are versions that portray him as like an arrogant guy. And his arrogance is on full display when he eats or maybe it's just implied by him eating the honey from the corpse of the animal, because that is like a major no-no back then. And he sort of like was on a power trip of, I'm the strongest guy around, so nobody can fuck with me. I can do whatever I want. But yeah, like he is
just ripping adrenal organs out of whoever he sees.
He's more mainstream portrayals of him are like, he's this folk hero almost, but actually in a lot of ways he was like a huge dickhead who was constantly disobeying God's orders.
Yeah, he had this remarkable gift from God, which is his strength that, famously is connected to the hair on his head. But I think that this movie, when we think about it like that, actually did a really good job of, one, capturing the very surreal quality of the Samson story and just the Old Testament in general, which I read some famous portions of it recently, and I had learned this stuff in Sunday school, but I was shocked at how bizarre they just throw the Samson and Delilah story specifically. They just throw in these little details. Yeah. Like the honey and the animal corpse that you read and you're like, this is actually really fucking weird.
A lot of Old Testament stories really require reading most of the other books to sort of get the subtlety in like characters' transgressions and their repayments for those transgressions.
So in Bible, we meet Samson, who does sort of give off, through his movement and through his just like countenance, definitely gives off this powerful but maybe a bit arrogant vibe. The actor who plays him is so hot. My pick for hottest guy in the film, personally. He kills some sort of like minion, a little person in a blue, vaguely afro wig who's like painted all white. I'm not 100% sure.
Well, he was an enemy of the Philistines.
Sure.
So I guess that was just supposed to be your run of the mill Philistine.
He kills one of these Philistines, perhaps, and then Delilah, who is played. I'm sorry, Joe. Remind me the actress's name. Delilah.
Gloria Grant.
Gloria Grant. Yes. Then Delilah, played by Gloria Grant, sees this happen, sees the aftermath of this, and essentially decides to take revenge. This sets up the very long and hot sequence, which is. It appears that Samson is kind of like taken by Delilah's beauty, purchases her sexual services, which goes through a long sort of softcore sexual ballet, which culminates in Delilah or one of her servants or minions actually gouging out Samson's eyes with fire, which is a testament to the actual story. That was just, in service of people who haven't seen the film, who want to know what happens in it as we discuss it generally. But
there's the epilogue too.
Oh yes, that's a good point. Can you bring up the epilogue, Julian?
The very final button on the story is we see, I believe, the Virgin Mary wandering through the desert, and she is pursued by either an angel or some sort of representation of God in sort of an abstract manner. He's got these two long blades or long silver objects that are held out like wings, and he descends upon her, and she sort of runs away terrified. But then when we see her on the ground, she's sort of enraptured in joy, and we cut to a neon sign for the Bethlehem Inn with no vacancy, and that's how the film ends.
Yeah, so Wakefield Poole has just taken us through many famous stories from both the Old and New Testament. He's done so in this psychosexual, this very surreal way. But ultimately, I was left feeling, like I said earlier, that he was trying to create a work that was beautiful and paid tribute to its source material, even though it could be considered very irreverent. But let's talk then about our general feelings of the film. The look and feel of the film. Joe, how would you say that, like, because I haven't seen any other of Wakefield Poole's films, this is my first of his, is the look and feel of this film aesthetically in line with his other work, or is there something particularly distinct about this one?
It's definitely in line with his 70s work. The opening of Bible is almost a direct reference to the opening of Boys in the Sand, where the protagonist of Boys in the Sand materializes out of the water. And his second film, Bijou, is shot on very similarly designed, kind of deliberately minimalist sets where abstract objects are used to stand in for real things. Probably my favorite shot in Bible is where Delilah disappears behind this like wicker spiral thing. And there's quite a bit of that, along with like similar forced perspective stuff in Bijou. His later movies are much more stylistically conventional, like they're shot in real places or distinguishably real places. But I think that definitely coming off the heels of Bijou, Bible feels very aesthetically in line.
I see. Yeah, I was really struck by that that set that you described, the sort of spiral wicker object. It was definitely the most like visually striking and beautiful moment of the film for me. It gave me this sort of like this moment of awe that captured, I think, like the sort of grandiose nature of just like the Bible in general, you know. What were our favorite parts of the film? Anything particularly that we, the hosts, enjoyed?
I liked when Delilah picked up the little blue person.
Yeah, that part was really funny. Yeah, at the end, after or right as she's about to like gouge out Samson's eyes, there's that scene of her like just picking up this little person that's dressed
like a blueberry.
Yeah,
it's really. I mean, the whole design, art direction of the Samson Delilah story is so incredible, but the little blue people are very very striking, and there's nothing else in the film like it.
Yeah. I think I particularly appreciated, like, as a gay guy myself, I think, like I said, I really appreciated the like gay male gaze of this film. Like, you know, I could see like fans of Wakefield Poole's work at the time being like a bit shocked or put off by the fact that he was trying to do, you know, like something heterosexual as opposed to like staying in his lane of gay hardcore. But I mean, obviously, yeah, if you wanted to see hardcore sex in a film, this is not the one for you. But like, I thought the film was definitely erotic from like a gay perspective. The way that it like meditated on and like depicted the beautiful male body was like a huge focus of the film. There was certainly appreciation for the female form as well, beautiful women and shots that really like studied their bodies, and, you know, good choreography that you know, was very sexy. But I think that this felt like a gay movie, you know, even though it was technically a straight movie. And I appreciated that. I thought it added some like erotic depth to the film that would make it different from other like heterosexual softcore.
So a note on the tone and perspective of the film. I might be somewhat misremembering here, but I'm pretty sure that Wakefield Poole has said in interviews about the film that part of his approach was to present the women of the Bible in ways that kind of took them out of the more conventional, like they cause the fall of man, or they are the corrupter of man, and paint them in a more sympathetic or relatable way. and going again to the Samson and Delilah sequence, and I think, and again, this is coming from what I remember Wakefield saying about that scene, the blue people are supposed to be like Delilah's servants or faithful or something like that, and what he was going for in that sequence was not so much to like lay out that Samson was evil as much as like he wronged her and therefore he was getting a just punishment, and that she's the one who has been like she's not the one who's initiating something evil or doing something bad. He is, and therefore he's getting a punishment that he deserves. So to again kind of reframe his story as not like the Bible hero, but a villain who was actually evil towards others.
Yeah, and I think that was accomplished with like a pretty remarkable grace in this film. Like, for example, we recently watched a film for this show, far different from this one, the 2018 film Mary Magdalene, starring Rooney Mara and Joaquin Phoenix, which sort of was trying to execute a similar concept, but with the story of Mary Magdalene, like was sort of trying to like elevate her often mistaken like idea of her as like just a prostitute who was hanging out with Jesus, and sort of elevate her to this like feminist icon in the Bible. I thought the movie did a really terrible job of that. It told and didn't show, and it sort of came off really just like political and like even cynical. But I thought this film was like, again, despite the fact that obviously Christians, in a traditional sense of the term, would find this film blasphemous just by the nature of the fact that it depicted sexuality. I thought that, Wakefield Poole executed that mission statement, like I said, very gracefully. It didn't feel like it was pushing an agenda. It just felt like a really imaginative and like empowering retelling of these stories, Yeah.
And it's interesting that we keep referring to it as a Christian film.
Yeah.
Wherein, like really, if you cut the last 3 minutes of the movie, it could be a Jewish film. I mean, it would be a Jewish film.
Sure.
True.
Or just a porno.
Yeah. But it ultimately it does stick within all four walls of the Bible.
So, this film Bible, watching it now seems like a pretty unique and remarkable film. Even in after decades of history past, I would imagine, even though I'm not as familiar with the genre as you, Joe, I would imagine that it's considered a pretty unique and remarkable film. How was it perceived at the time? Was it unique for its genre? How did it perform? Things like that. What was the context for its popular reception at the time?
It was pretty universally dismissed. Not so much in like this is blasphemous or there's no place for this sort of material in a sex film. It was mostly dismissed on the level of not being cynical enough. Like I think that this is going back to what I was talking about earlier, where there was this intersection between the underground art world and the sex film world. And a lot of the underground art world was and still is very cynical towards a lot of religious iconography and religious symbolism and beliefs. So a film like this, which, as I think we've all agreed, doesn't try to make fun of or feel like above the biblical stories that it's based on, but rather interpret them in a very specific way. It didn't really strike the type of chord that Wakefield Poole was, I think, going for, which was to essentially create a movie that could be enjoyed on a midnight movie basis. Like, it's not funny, it's slow, it's very deliberately slow and methodical, so it doesn't have like that quick-paced, keep your eyes glued to the screen or you'll miss something ridiculous vibe. So it kind of came and went and ended up being a huge commercial disaster for him. He paid for it out of pocket and lost tens of thousands of dollars on the movie. And it was, at that point, his most expensive film. So it basically almost bankrupted him.
Oh, wow.
And caused him to leave New York because he was so dejected because of how poorly the film performed and how indifferent, not really negative, but just like indifferent everyone seemed to be.
Yeah, it doesn't really, as somebody who loves a good midnight movie, I totally agree. It does not have a midnight movie vibe. It does have a midnight movie aesthetic, but definitely not the vibe.
Yeah, there's something to what you were saying, Joe. It feels like I appreciate it for what it is. I enjoyed watching it, but it does feel like it's in between a couple levels of like how someone might appreciate it. And it's not maybe enough of one thing for it to have been commercially viable. You know, it's campy, but it's not like campy enough that it's going to make you laugh out loud watching it. It's maybe too reverent. I think the slowness was delightful to watch as someone who likes slow movies, but yeah, I could see it not doing well in that target demographic, you know.
And one other thing to interject stylistically in regards to the slow factor, the Samson and Delilah sequence, you probably noticed, has a weird look to it in terms of how people move.
Yeah.
The entire sequence was shot at 30 frames a second.
Oh.
Yeah, I was going to say it seemed like it was slowed down a little bit too.
Yeah, the entire thing is 25% slower than actual movement.
It looked really cool.
And the reason for that is because he wanted to give a certain surreal gracefulness to everyone's movements so that even if someone sort of moved jerkily, they would still have like a constant grace.
That's so cool. Well, I think that was a good call. I think that worked for it.
Yeah, it was weird, like in a good way. It was like, yeah, I think that slight uncanniness, you know, if it was like 50% slowed down, maybe it would have been clear it was slow-mo, but that 25% slowdown playing with the different frames, the unconventional frames per second is like, it just created this slight like supernatural uncanniness that made everything feel dreamy and like kind of hypnotized. So yeah, that was an introductory look at Wakefield Poole's very interesting 1973 film Bible, which if you're listening and like unique film experiences, I highly recommend you pick up the DVD from Vinegar Syndrome. But what did we think, boys? What is the official Boys Bible Study rating of Bible?
I'll give it 2 out of 2 ass cracks full of sand.
What makes you say that? What'd you like about this film?
Yeah, it was a fun, good time for the whole family. Yeah, not quite art house, not quite midnight movie. Thought the Benny Hill chase sequence could have been cut down a little bit.
Or just sped up a little bit, right?
Yeah. Either one kind of loses its punch when it goes on for like 3.5 minutes. But other than that, I thought it was a really, really beautiful portrayal of the Old Testament, particularly the Samson and Delilah segment. It had some really incredible set design and beautiful imagery.
Yeah, it really did. I loved this movie more on second watch than the first watch. And I, since you bring it up, Julian, I'm going to give this a perfect score of 3.5 out of 3.5 minutes of Benny Hinn style chase scene.
Benny Hinn or Benny Hill?
For me. Oh my God. Yeah. Benny Hill. You know what's funny though? I keep thinking Benny Hinn in my head. But
that's the Christian boy in you.
Yeah. It's just where we're at.
The Christian.
I really appreciated how nothing in this movie really felt like outside of the Bible to me. Like I think you could say this is fully biblical. But there's, of course, things going on in it that I was taught in church that are like wrong for me to see. So that was like a pretty fun like dichotomy for me. One of the other movies you had mentioned to us, Joe, that I did end up getting a chance to watch was I Saw Jesus Die. And one similar thing about that is also completely biblically based. Every story that happens in it really is a Bible story. They just, between every single story, managed to fit in a sex sequence as well, which could have been going on in the Bible as well. So
yeah, absolutely.
I thanks for opening up this world to us.
I just want to add that this film, to me, feels like it is the most like true to the text representations of stories from the Old Testament. Particularly like the New International Version, I think, is one that sort of, the English translation just sort of gives you the text as brief as possible without any, I mean, the King James translation is really beautiful, but like, I think when you get it down to like the Hemingway prose version of the Bible, you really get this like abstract surrealness to the stories that leaves a lot of it open for interpretation or, you know, lack thereof. In like the Samson and Delilah story, you see these like sound stages that are just like done up in a very minimalistic way, but say so much with so little.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and I think that's something that Bible captured well. My personal rating of the film, I loved it. I think, you know, although there was something at first when I was like, oh, how campy is this going to be, and it didn't turn up the camp all the way to 100. I was like, you know, okay. I was a little confused, but once I settled into like the groove of the film, I thought it was really beautiful. I'm going to have to give this film 5 out of 5 cock rings. And I say that because I read in an interview with Wakefield Poole that he believes that his first film, Boys in the Sand, that's correct? Yeah, Boys in the Sand. He believes that film almost single-handedly popularized cock rings. I guess in the opening sequence, the man that emerges from the water has like a cock ring, and apparently cock ring sales went way up after that movie. That's what he says himself in an interview. So I have no reason to doubt him.
Cock rings.
Yeah,
any cock will do.
What about you, Joe? What's your final thoughts about Bible? How would you rate it personally?
I don't think I'm clever enough to come up with.
You give us way too much credit,
and that's all right. You can say whatever you want in closing thoughts about the film.
Yeah, I guess for me, having seen all of Wakefield Poole's film features, he did a few video features as well, which I haven't seen. I think that this ranks definitely higher in his filmography than it probably has been reviewed at over the years. It definitely has its shortcomings. I think that the Bathsheba sequence is definitely the weakest of the film, and I agree that the Benny Hill chase scene does go on about 3.5 minutes longer than it should. Yeah, I think that's maybe more a reflection of my taste than what's good or bad about the film.
It's probably funnier back then.
There really are so many beautiful and really original elements to it that, like, when I rewatched it, or more so skimmed through it yesterday in anticipation of this, I was happy that, looking at it again, I felt compelled to actually pay attention instead of keeping it on as background noise. And I think that that's a rarity with movies of this particular ilk. And I'm not saying sex films, but like the ones that fall into the category that I've named manufactured midnight movies, which are movies that were made specifically with the intention of becoming a midnight movie as opposed to just falling into that. Because a lot of them age really badly and they just kind of become dumb or hard to get through. And I think that there's really so much interesting stuff to look at here, even if things become repetitive, that it stands up to repeated viewings.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I'm really curious to check out more of Wakefield Poole's work after this, because I find him now to be a really compelling figure in cinema. Joe, I'm really grateful that you came on and introduced this film to us and had this conversation. I learned a lot. Thank you for your time today.
Glad you invited me.
I want to say before we sign off, to anyone who's listening who is not familiar with Vinegar Syndrome, please go to their website, vinegarsyndrome.com, and check out the really impressive catalog of releases in the field of genre and exploitation film. You can make your whole taste in movies like from their collection. It's really remarkable. Joe, anything else you'd like to say about Vinegar Syndrome and like places online where people could, for instance, follow it or you or your work? How can people connect with your work?
We have a mailing list which anyone can sign up for and get my sometimes cynical monthly newsletters that I usually write the day before. There's also a couple of Facebook fan pages that we don't run, but we sort of lurk around and occasionally answer questions on. We have Instagram, Twitter, an official Facebook page, Blu-ray.com forum thread, which is sometimes an interesting read for petty controversies.
I love message boards.
But really, like I said at the beginning, our mantra has always been to present all forms and genres of genre film on an equal playing field. And that's what we continue to strive for. And I think that movies like Bible are a great part of our catalog because they're films that, you're really not going to be able to access elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's such a huge portion of cinematic history, and I'm grateful that you and your work and your company are dedicated to preserving all these important films and sometimes overlooked films. So, thanks again for joining us today. On the Boys Bible Study side of things, before we sign off, let me say, if you enjoy our free episodes, which you, by the way, can access them all at boysbiblestudy.com with links to your favorite podcasting apps there to subscribe. I would also invite you to check out patreon.com/boysbiblestudy for $5 a month or more, a subscription of $5 a month or more. You can access our entire back catalog of bonus episodes that will never be released to the public. We make at least 2 extra episodes a month for our subscribers. Also, shout outs to our patron saints at the $20 tier, Nicole, Russell, Marissa, and Jeff. We really appreciate your support. Our outro music is Oh My God by pop singer Mary. Check out Mary on Bandcamp and Spotify. For all of us here at Boys Bible Study, myself, Ash, my co-hosts, Scott and Julian, our special guest today, Joe Rubin of Vinegar Syndrome, we would like to say, peace be with you. And also with you.
Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I feel your love in me, it's coming from within. Oh my God. My devotion is so unwavering. Divine emotions when you